So I'm going to do just really quickly a review of what we talked about last week, and then we'll move into a second part relevant to the actual postures and performances of the prayer. Thanks, man. So for those who weren't here last week, and as a recap for those who were, we talked about conditions of the prayer, and this is in reference to ritual prayer within Islam, right? Which is different from supplicating to God, which you can do in any language, pretty much in any place, in any time, any state. You don't even have to be Muslim. There's a verse in the Quran that says, وَقَالَ رَبُّكُمُ ادْعُونِي أَسْتَجِبْ لَكُمْ, that say, وَقَالَ رَبُّكُمْ, your Lord, says, ud'uni, like call upon me, make dua to me, supplicate to me, astajib lakum, I will respond. And what the explanation of that verse is that even if somebody's not Muslim and they turn to God and engage God in supplication, God hears the prayer and responds to the prayer and answers to the prayer. What we're talking about is not that kind of prayer. We're talking about the ritual prayer that takes place 5 times a day in Islam. It's called Salah. And what we talked about last week were the conditions of the prayer, meaning these things have to happen in order for you to begin the prayer itself. Before you commence the prayer, these things have to be taken into consideration and ensured are present. Does that make sense? So all of this is outside of the prayer, but you're kind of lining them up to make sure that they're checked off before you begin. So the first thing that we discussed was that before one prays, they have to be in a state of ritual purity, meaning what we call wudu. This is, in English, translated very archaic language, ablution, but you're like washing up for prayer. And when you go through the washing up, which we talked about months ago, I'm happy to review that with people who might not have been there when we did that, or walk you through it, or we can even do that like next week if there's enough people who haven't gone through it, or it'd be helpful to them. But you're essentially washing parts of your body that are pretty easily accessible, right? When you're in a minor state of what's called ritual impurity. And you enter into that state if you use the bathroom, right? If you pass wind, if you've like slept beyond dozing. So if one of you, for example, just kind of like knocks out for a minute or two while I'm talking, that is not in and of itself enough of a state of sleep that you would now have to do this again. And once you do this, you're in that state until something breaks it again. So it's not that before every prayer you have to do it, but if you do it once and you maintain it, then that suffices. Does that make sense? And this is getting us into a place where a common thread for all of this is you're starting to just inculcate mindfulness within you, right? You're getting to a place of just awareness, consciousness, the way that you would be readying yourself for anything that had a certain level of importance to it. This is something that is done pretty easily once you get the hang of it, but it's still meant to be done with presence so that you are starting to align yourself, not just on a physical level, but on a metaphysical level, like mentally, emotionally, spiritually, as well as physically aligned towards the prayer. So that first is that you are going to essentially wash up for prayer. Second, you're going to ensure that the place you're praying, your physical body, the clothing that you have, all of these things are also free of anything that is deemed to be ritualistically impure. So, for example, in New York City, you could have people that would say, I'm not going to pray on the sidewalk, it is a sidewalk. But the default in Sharia is that everything is assumed to be clean unless there's a reason to believe that it's not clean, right? So a physical manifestation, an odor, like discoloration, these kind of things could allude to something. But it's not that just because you're walking on the street of Manhattan, it means that the sidewalk is dirty. And you'll find Muslims praying pretty much everywhere, all over, but the place in and of itself has to be clean. So of the few places one couldn't pray, like a bathroom, you're not allowed to perform ritual prayer in, mostly because of the chance that something that's impure, like urine, might be present someplace. There's a likelihood of that. And similarly on clothing, etc. You're going to cover your nakedness, like when you're in a state of prayer, right? And for men, this is going to be from your navel to below your knee. For women, it's everything other than your face, your hands, and your feet. And that becomes a part of it. You won't see a man like praying in those clothes, right? Like the way all of you are dressed right now would suffice. And that's kind of what the baseline understanding should be. But you can again see kind of the thread of just awareness, mindfulness. You're going to face towards Mecca, in particular towards the Kaaba. In Arabic, this direction is called the Qibla. And people have apps on their phone. You can use compasses. It's really easy to use the sun. And there's a lot that's very elemental in its relationship within Islam. Right? The idea is not that you're just constantly stuck in your old world. When we wash up, we're washing up with water. Our prayer times are based off of a cyclical pattern of the sun. You can tell the direction of Mecca by understanding kind of where the sun is positionally. The idea is that you're relating to the world around you, right? You're in a place where you become attuned to kind of nature and natural elements and building relationship with things as a mechanism to deepen in awareness. The facing towards Mecca is something that in the United States is done northeast, and you have like leeway. Other than if you're literally standing in Mecca and the Kaaba is right in front of you, then there's not really leeway there. Do you know? Because it's right in front of you. You know where it is. But where you're in other spaces, there's a leeway of 45 degrees in either direction, because it's going to be hard to, if I literally have something in front of me, then I know how to position myself towards it, right? But if this thing was 3 rooms over and we said, try to face it, you're going to do your best to face it, but there's a good chance that it's not going to be as precise as when the thing is right in front of you. Does that make sense? The time of the prayer comes in, meaning you can't pray the prayer preceding the time of the prayer. We talked last week about, what times the prayer actually comes in. These prayer times change like day to day because they're based off of a cyclical pattern of the sun. So, right now, like our morning prayer that takes place between true dawn and sunrise is much earlier than it would be in like late December when the days are shorter, right? And daylight savings times kicks in different ways, And you'll see that throughout the year. And it's also, again, like interesting to think out, especially for us in the States, that you experience both daily practices as well as seasonal holidays at various junctures in the calendar year, because they're not all going to happen on a lunar calendar at the same time aligned with a Gregorian calendar, right? The lunar calendar is about 11 days earlier in terms of its comparison year to year to the Gregorian calendar. So when I was in college and I was 18, Ramadan, for example, was around Christmas time, right? Ramadan this year was in April, So it's shifting slowly. But you get to experience these things in different ways, and kind of adapt and relate to them in different ways too, right? And it helps to not make it monotonous, in that sense. Then you're going to have an intention. This is all still outside of the prayer, right? And the intention is affirming the act that you're about to undertake, right? Citing the units of prayer. We're going to talk about these, the number of cycles that goes into it, its kind of categorization in terms of legality, these kinds of things. And then you have what's called the tahrima, which is an initial invocation. that if you've ever seen Muslims pray, or you've prayed yourself, they do typically what's called a takbir, Allahu Akbar. They'll raise their hands up, and now they're in the state of prayer, right? That's a quick recap of what we talked about last week. Does all that make sense?
Yes.
Any questions? Any thoughts on any of that? Yeah? Sure? Okay. So we're going to talk about a few things today. One, we're going to talk about what are the obligatory elements of the prayer within the Hanafi school, which is the legal school that we're using to discuss prayer. And I want you to think about this in three different kind of modes. And we talked about it somewhat some months ago when we were talking about prayer. But just to kind of go into it a little bit deeper for this class. And then in the latter half of the class, we're going to talk about kind of the season that we're in right now. It's the first day of the first month of the new year on the Islamic calendar. The month is called Muharram, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means to Muslims who are Sunni, Muslims who are Shia. Right now, at the end of the hall, our Shia community is hosting a program that they'll be doing for the next 10 days and nights, relevant to Muharram, and I'll explain that in a little bit. Next week, there's a couple of fasting days that within the Sunni tradition are observed around Muharram. We'll explain some of what that is also. Relevant to like the days that we're in right now, just so people can kind of preemptively start thinking about some of it. And also like what are some of the actual differences between Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, and where's there commonality that fits in with the definition that all of us are Muslim. There's kind of the gross majority very much in common, but things that are rooted in authoritative and theological difference that informs like ritualistic practice that's different. Does that make sense? So we'll do that in the second half of the class. So really quickly, just because a few more people have trickled in, would be great is if we can take a minute, if you guys could just, again, introduce yourselves to the people sitting around you, just so we also start getting to know each other. The nice thing about this class is that typically has around this many people, or maybe like another 5 or 10, but it's easy to get to know people when it's a smaller group of people. So you can take 2 quick minutes, just introduce yourselves to the people sitting around you, names, like kind of, how did your day go today, and then we'll come back and get into the next topic. But go ahead. Great. Should we get started again? Yeah, people know each other a little bit. So I want you to think about this within 3 different frames. Today we're going to talk about the obligations, which are the fara'id, the fard, individual acts. If these are not present at a minimum, then the prayer isn't valid. Like once you're in the prayer, right? Not outside of the prayer. We just talked about the outer parts to it. But this essentially becomes what you want to conceptualize as like the skeleton of the prayer, right? If you were to compare it to you yourself as a physical being, the skeleton in and of itself is this. And then you have what we'll talk about next week, which are the necessary acts. They are not at the level of obligation. This is what you have to do as a minimum. And why we want to do this is for 2 reasons. One, when you are new to Islam, whether you were born into it and you're just trying to rebuild the relationship or you convert to it, the prayer in and of itself is an obligation, the 5 daily prayers, right? So if you remember, we talked about this spectrum of actions that on one end is what's called fard, or obligatory. These are those things that have clear evidence, like text, and the meaning is also clear. It's definitive, like both in text and meaning, for it to be considered an obligation. At the other end of the spectrum was the word haram, which means strictly prohibited. And it's the same basis that both text and meaning have to be definitive. And then there were, in the middle, what's called mubah. This means neutral. And then here you had what is called mustahab, or recommended. Sorry, my handwriting's terrible. And then over here you have what's called makruh, or disliked. These two inner categories, mustahab and makruh, they are things that are lesser defined than what is obligatory and prohibited. And in the Hanafi school, they add in the category of wajib, which essentially is saying that it's important, but either text or meaning, one or the other, is probabilistic. It's not as definitive, right? So the performance of 5 daily prayers is definitive in text and meaning. It's an obligation. So why we're going through this is it's super easy to do just what are the actual integral parts, the obligatory parts of the prayer, because if somebody converted to Islam right now, the prayer becomes obligatory upon them after they converted. So as they're learning the rest of these, this is the skeleton, what's necessary, you conceptualize is kind of everything that goes on top of the skeleton, the flesh, that gives you shape. And then what's recommended is kind of that last layer that kind of beautifies and ornaments like what's there. For a lot of people, what happens is the minute they become Muslim, they're told that they have to do this last phase right from the beginning, which that's not how Islam as a religion works. You don't have to study Islam. You could if you chose to, but you're not required to study and know anything of practice and ritual when you take like the Shahada and you convert to Islam. So there's not like a 6-month course that everyone takes in order to convert. Do you know? You kind of pick it up as you go along. Do you know what I mean? There's all kinds of reasons like people become Muslim. I've met people who they've been in a Muslim country and they heard the call to prayer and it was so beautiful. They followed it to a mosque, and then from the mosque they heard some people talking and they said, this religion makes sense to me. I met people who literally are morticians, that their job was to bury deceased people, and they appreciated the way that Muslim people treated their dead in comparison to others, that became an entry point for them. Others who were housekeepers in apartment complexes that saw just how clean that Muslims' clothes were that they were laundering for them, and when they inquired, how is it that this is so clean, they would say that because of those conditions we talked about. So all of those people, they didn't sit down and say, I know how to X, Y, and Z ritually before becoming Muslim. And people have varied journeys, right? There's going to be people who you might meet, might be you yourself, who you came and prayed with a bunch of people before and tried to figure out what does this mean and this and that. That's fine. No one's saying that's wrong to do, but it's not something that's contingent upon your conversion, right? For one to convert, they don't have to know how to do it beforehand, but after they've converted, when the prayer time comes, they got to pray. And it's important for a second reason, that if you're going to teach somebody how to do it, you want to teach them in a sequential order, because if you overwhelm somebody with what's going to be this last list, what we're talking about today is just going to be 6 things, and of them, most are just about how you stand and how you bow and how you prostrate. It has nothing to do with reciting anything, right? There's going to be one point where we talk about saying something in Arabic that's really minimal, that suffices as you are learning these other parts to it. Does that make sense? Does it? Can somebody say back to me what I just said so that I know that what I'm saying actually makes sense? Why are we doing this?
It's the bare minimum. It's the most important and the bare minimum, so that when we start praying, we know what's actually necessary before getting overwhelmed with everything else.
Great. So this is where you start. And when you're doing the prayers, and you don't want to get into your head, and second guess yourself, right? That says, well, it doesn't look the way everybody else's does. You're going at a pace that makes sense for you. This is why in this bucket was the first chapter of the Quran, Surah Fatiha, that we looked at for like 3 or 4 weeks in meaning and what it was about. Because how will you know how to recite it right from the first day? You don't speak Arabic, you've never like read Arabic in your life, the letters are not even all the same like sounds, right? There's no ayn in English, there's no ha in English, right? There's no ra, there's no kha, there's not cognates of all of these things. So it creates an entry point that can be really kind of burdensome because you want to try to do your best, but the idea isn't that making it harder on yourself is somehow better. You kind of go in a process. And when somebody is new to Islam, it's a valid reason to do only this part, right? The idea is that you should be doing this unless there's a reason not to. And there's a reason not to because you don't know how to do it yet. Does that make sense? Yeah? So we're going to go through this. This is what you're going to think of as the skeleton to the prayer. And then from there, we're going to talk next week about what the necessary actions are, which included what we were talking about for the last few weeks, like the recitation of the first chapter. And then we'll talk about the recommended. We'll talk about what are things that are disliked in a prayer and what are things that nullify the prayer, like what breaks a prayer. Does that make sense? And we'll be doing that over the course of the next 4 to 5 weeks. Okay. Great. So, the first part to what becomes obligatory, a fard in your prayer, some people consider the last condition, which we had outside of the prayer, as being potentially also understood as the first necessary, the first obligatory part of prayer. Does anybody remember what the last condition was that we had listed here? Huh?
Intention?
Yeah. It was after intention. What did you say?
I was thinking of the spectrum around.
So before we had the spectrum,
Oh.
the list that we went through just to review from last week.
Oh, the Tarima?
The tahrima, right? What was that? Do people remember?
Allahu Akbar.
So Allahu Akbar is one of the things it could be, but the tahrima itself is just like an opening invocation, right? It's got to be something that is essentially proclaiming some kind of idea of God's greatness, In the next kind of sections that we talk about, it's going to be that as you distill it, you're going to say Allahu Akbar. So if you're able to say that, that's fine. But here, it's considered like what's entering you into the state of prayer. So some people see it as a condition outside, what we had listed before, and some people will say it's like the first obligatory part to it, right? Both functionally do the same thing because they're both obligations, right? It's either an obligation that is the last thing that is outside of the prayer, or it's an obligation that is the first thing that's the first part of the prayer. Does that make sense? Functionally, it's the same thing. This in and of itself now is still doing what we said it did last week. It has the same letters as the word you said before. What was that word?
Haram.
Yeah, so you can still see that, right? Haram, tahrima. The idea is what's happening now when you're entering into the state of prayer is that you are rendering in that moment things that are normally permissible, impermissible. So when you're in a state of prayer, like you're not talking to the person next to you. The way you could talk right now, you all were introducing yourselves to each other, your phone rings, you're not picking up your phone, right? So silence it if you can. But you're not doing actions that if someone was to see you do those actions, they would understand you to not be in a state of prayer. Does that make sense? So you can't like eat while you're praying, right? Like someone's leading the prayer. You know, I tell this to people at the end of Ramadan. My son is 7 years old, and when we were breaking fast, he was here some nights, and he positioned like right in front of him a juice box that he had, and whenever he would go down in the prayer, he would like sip the juice, and I could hear him, right? And I knew he was going to do it, and then when he did it, it was pretty amazing. And then at the end of it, he's looking at me. He's very like well satiated and stuff. He's a little kid, you know, but like we couldn't do that in the course of the prayer, right? It's just something that what you would normally be doing, you're now not doing that, you know, and within it, other things that might be distractions in the course of the prayer. Was that Luna?
Yeah, that's from Luna.
She didn't want to come back in here. So you want to think that out for yourself, you know? What are things that are distractions? And how do you also avoid like doing things that fundamentally you know are not going to work? I had a roommate who's like, how are y'all doing? Come in. One of my roommates before I got married, he was, you know, watching one of the NBA Finals games, and the time for our fourth prayer of the day came in. That has a small window. It's sunset. It's called Maghrib. And as we were getting like into the time, I was like, hey, we got to pray. In my apartment, if any of y'all have been to our apartment, you know, some of you were there for the brunch that we did on Sunday, right? The TV is like really kind of close to the direction of prayer, you know? Like the TV is here and the prayer direction is this way. So I was like, hey, let's pray. And he was like, yeah, let's do it. And he just muted the television, right? And I was like, man, you gotta turn the TV off. He's like, no, it's not a problem. I was like, no, you know? Because like literally, we'd be standing and the game would still be going on in front of us. Do you know what I mean? So the idea is that you want to recognize it as also an entrance into a state of awareness. It's a spiritual act. As much as you are engaged in something that has mechanics and ritual to it, if it's done in the way that it's intended to be done, just like any exercise, it'll yield you what is done by the exercise being performed correctly, right? So you don't want to also create opportunities for you that are going to render things as potentially now having you do something that otherwise would kind of invalidate the prayer, right? You can't watch TV while you're praying. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense, right? You can't be like talking to somebody or eating something or doing these kinds of things. So this initial invocation at an obligatory level is just you reciting something that is glorifying God in some capacity. And so you could theoretically say other words also, but if you're able to say that Allahu Akbar, then that is what you're going to do. Does that make sense? And this is done with all those other conditions that we talked about being in place. The second obligatory act of prayer, not necessary or recommended. This is what's creating the skeleton that renders validity to the prayer, is that you are going to stand, if able to, for the obligatory prayers. So there are different types of prayers that you have. There's some that are voluntary, right, and some that are obligatory. So what does that mean, right? Well, one, somebody might not be physically capable of standing, like they don't have the ability to stand. You know, they could be kind of in a wheelchair. My father, now maybe like 6 years ago, had a severe stroke that rendered him without the ability to speak and left him paralyzed on the right side of his body. He can't stand for prayer, right? There's still a prayer that he would perform, but it's not going to be the same as like the way that I would pray. So he's not able to stand for the obligatory prayers, right? if you are perhaps on an airplane, for example, situationally, like the parts that you could stand for, you'd need to stand for. But say there's turbulence, say they force you to put on your seatbelt, right? You are not able to like stand in your chair. There's no like room to do that for whatever reason. Then that's different. So standing if you are able to for the obligatory prayer. Standing in and of itself is rooted in like your entire being upright and understanding that you're in a place where we're not talking about like other things that you would typically see Muslims do when they're praying. Do you know what I mean? Like what are other things that you have seen people do in the course of their standing in prayer? You raise their hands. Yeah, what else?
Of course.
Put your hands someplace, right? Some people got them here. Some people got them here. Some people got them here. None of that is written here. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? So you're standing if you're able to for the obligatory prayer. In the Hanafi school, for voluntary prayers, the standing is not an obligatory part to it. So if you're doing extra prayers, like you'll see a lot of people, once they're done with your obligatory prayer, they might just stay like kneeling on the ground and they're on their knees and they just like start their prayer and then they're doing everything else that they need to do, right? But that standing is a second obligation. So one, you're just going to begin the prayer. And here again, we didn't say about raising your hands or anything like that. You're just indicating a start to the prayer through this invocation. And then you're standing if you're able to. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Sure? Right? Like, and you could say, is that like how people do it? We're not talking about the last phase. We're saying in this initial phase, as you're getting to it, these are the obligations that we want to be able to make sure are taking place.
Situationally, is it possible to pray on an airplane? Like if you can't stand up anywhere, but like say
Yeah, you would pray in your seat,
Okay.
and to the best of your ability, you would pray. If you can't face towards Mecca,
Yeah.
then you would try the best of your ability to also face towards Mecca.
Okay.
You got to pray the prayer in the window of time that it comes in.
Yeah.
And in a few weeks, we'll talk about what do you do when you're traveling, because there's like different rules about shortening prayers, and some people say you could combine prayers. So you could pray Dhuhr and Asr together, Maghrib and Isha together when you're traveling. But we'll talk about all of that in detail, you know? Yeah. But if you have the ability to stand, like you want to stand in your prayer, like you're required to stand, so you should stand. Yeah?
And so then the window of prayer is between each, right? Or is it?
The window of prayer, there's a different window of prayer for every prayer. So if we had the horizon, right? The way the first prayer of the day starts is like, say the sun is here below the horizon and it's getting closer, like the light from the sun is coming up. So at this point, the sky is like very red and orange. At this point, it's getting very light. And when the actual part of the sun comes above the horizon, that's when the window of time stops for that prayer. Does that make sense? So you have this entire time, like today, this was probably about an hour and 40 minutes to pray this prayer, right? And the performance of it, you could do in like a few minutes, especially if you're doing it the way that we're saying here, do you know? The second prayer of the day, like starts when the sun begins to descend from its zenith. This was a little bit after 1 p.m. today. It goes until the third prayer of the day, which is in the mid-afternoon. And there's two opinions on this. Like your shadow is 1 time its length or twice its length. And you don't have to know this, but just to give you an idea of how it's going. And this was like around 5 p.m. or like a little after 6 today. So you would have had like 5 hours to do that one, you know? And then this one goes until the time of sunset. So, which is around like 8:20 something. So you have like 3 hours for that, right? And then from that until Isha, which is a little, right, like around 10 o'clock. That's like a short window, but it's about an hour and a half still, an hour-ish, right? And then you could theoretically pray the last prayer of the day until the time that this one starts. You'd have from like 10 till 4 something in the morning, but better to pray it like in the first half of the night than kind of delaying it unnecessarily. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you're going to stand if you're able to. Then the third is you're going to recite any short verse of the first 2 cycles of an obligatory prayer and every cycle of a voluntary prayer, or what we also call, like a different category that's called the witr prayer, that we can talk about in a bit. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean you have to recite the first chapter of the Quran, Surah Fatiha. It doesn't mean you have to recite the entire chapter of a short, like, chapter, or like one very long verse. Those are things that we'll discuss when we get into the necessary acts and the recommended acts. The shortest verse in the Quran is 2 words in Arabic. It says, thumma nadir, right? Do you want to repeat after me? Thumma, like, so the way it's pronounced is like the word theta in Arabic, right? Theta, people want to say theta. Theta, right? So you get the tha and theta. So thumma is with the tha and theta. Thumma nadir. That's it. If you just say that, that's all the Arabic you got to say in the prayer. In that first wave of learning. Does that make sense? Some of you in the room have either been taught or taught others that you got to do a lot more than that in the beginning. It creates a lot of stress. It creates a lot of anxiety, right? That, am I allowed to do it this way? Can I read this? Can I have something playing in my ear while I'm doing it? Don't feel like you did anything wrong, right? Because you're trying to figure out if somebody is engaging you, either virtually or in person, that they might know how to pray, but they might not know how to teach you how to pray, right? As you're going through it in a pedagogy that makes sense, relevant to where you are. Do you get what I mean? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes. You
also don't want to get in your own head, right? That says, but it's not the same, because you're working towards something. So why, we spent a good chunk of time breaking down the first chapter, Surah Fatiha, because it's a necessary. It's the second box of category. It's a necessary act, and you want to put in reasonable time to learning it, and not just its translation, but why we spend so much time on its meaning. Because you can learn the translation of something, but it still isn't going to invoke the meaning of it, And for it to be a real spiritual experience, doesn't mean you have to speak Arabic, because you can speak Arabic and you still might not really get what it means, right? What is it trying to convey? What is it going to invoke? If you missed those sessions, we have them all recorded. They're on our podcast, they're on our YouTube channel, and we can go through those as well. But the base of this is that when you're starting, you're going to just have to say and recite any short verse of the Quran, right? And the shortest verse, it just says this, thumma nadir, right? It's a complete verse, and that suffices. Does that make sense? Yeah, go ahead.
It's not too complicated of a question.
Thumma nadir means, and then he looked. Yeah, so thumma means then in Arabic, and nadir is a sight of the eye, right? So if someone said yandur, it would mean he looks or he sees, right? Tandur means like she looks, right? So nadir, glasses have like the same root in Arabic, right? You're wearing glasses. So you get, right? It just means, and then he looks. Any other questions? You have your hand raised?
Yeah, I just want to check with Tahrima, do we do the Nia also?
That was one of the
That's an
conditions outside of the prayer.
obligation.
Yeah, so it's not part of the prayer. This is like in the prayer now where the obligations. So those 6 things that we talked about last week, those are the things that you need outside of the prayer, right? Wudu, clean place to pray, nothing like dirty on your body, your clothes, you're facing towards Mecca, like the prayer time came in, you know, those things that we discussed. Yeah? Yeah.
The word verse, is it also the same as ayah? Like,
Yeah, it's just any short ayah with a Quran, like a verse. So the Arabic word for verse is ayah. Ayah means like a sign, right? And signs are like indicators of something deeper, do you know? That's the whole idea with this, is that Islam doesn't divorce religion, spirituality, and ethics, but it synergizes them so that when you're looking at something, you see it as a signpost for like something with a deeper meaning. You know, it gives you an opportunity to find beauty in what surrounds you. Does that make sense? Right? So that's when ayah is, it's like a sign, but a sign not in the sense of like, you know, a stop sign or like a billboard, but like it's a sign of something, like indicating something more than just what's most apparent, right? Okay. Then the 4th is bowing. So if we distinguish between bowing and standing, like standing in like posture is such that you're standing in such a way that if you were standing like straight enough so that your arms wouldn't like touch like your knees, right? Bowing, distinct from standing, is that your bowing is like movement enough that your hands are actually then touching your knees. Does that make sense? Yeah? In Arabic, this is called ruku'. So there's a bowing element to this. And then you have what's the prostration element. Sorry, did anybody have any questions on the bowing part to it? Yeah.
I have a question on the previous part about
Okay.
the prayer windows. Does it mean if you wake up after sunrise that you missed Fajr?
Yeah, you have to make it up, and we'll talk up how to make up a prayer. But because it's an obligatory act, like you still have to do it even if you've done it late. So you would make it up if you slept through it.
But they don't add up. So like, let's say you slept in after Dhuhr.
If you slept till Dhuhr time,
Well, not necessarily.
that would be so
slept,
amazing.
but- I wish.
Like, man, I don't even know the last time I slept that long. Oh my god. Yeah, go ahead.
Say you missed Fajr and then you missed Dhuhr.
Sure.
You
So
have
if
to
you
go.
miss prayers, right? Say you miss, there's a distinction between missing like more than 5 and less than 5. Does that make sense? So if I missed Fajr, I should pray Fajr before I pray Dhuhr. And if I missed Fajr and Dhuhr, I'd have to pray those before I pray Asr, right? You kind of get the logic. If I miss any 5, I don't have to pray those before, like say you miss now more than these, you don't then have to pray them before you pray the next one, but you still are obligated to make them up. Does that make sense? And then there's different scenarios, right? Like say you missed Fajr and you came in and all of us were praying Dhuhr, and you pray Dhuhr with us, and then you make up Fajr after. But you gotta make up your prayers. Like they're seen as things that you are required to do. And it's something that the requirement extends, like it's seen as like a debt, essentially, that you would do them. Yeah.
I have a question about praying during, or making prayer during the forbidden time. So before you erase it, so let's say I miss Dhuhr.
Yeah.
right? and Asr comes in, I would have to make a Dhuhr before I pray Asr, but technically you're not supposed to pray another, or I don't know, there's nothing between like Asr and Maghrib. So do I still pray Dhuhr between Asr and Maghrib to make it up, or do I make up Dhuhr after Maghrib?
If you were praying Asr, why would you pray it before you prayed Dhuhr? Like if you had to pray Dhuhr, right? Why wouldn't you do that first, even if you missed it?
Just because Asr time came in. So I wasn't sure if like, because Asr time came in, that's the first thing I do is pray Asr, and then still make up Dhuhr, or like.
You should pray Dhuhr first,
Oh.
like because you have a window of time to pray Asr, right? So why the question is there is because once you've prayed Asr, there's no prayers after you've prayed Asr time, right? It's like it's a time that's prohibited to pray. There's like a few times that one's not supposed to pray. When the sun is at its highest, and the time that a part of the sun is risen from the horizon until it's fully risen, and after Asr, till like once you've prayed Asr, there's no prayer until Maghrib time.
So I thought it was just when the time of Asr comes in, that's it, no more Dhuhr. I didn't realize it was like you have until like, even if it's like the last few minutes of Asr
Yeah,
time.
so you should pray Dhuhr before you prayed Asr.
That makes sense.
Yeah, right.
That would be Qaza, right? Qaza, Zohar, and then Asr, right?
Yeah, it's a make-up prayer. Like you're praying it late. In Arabic, the word is called qada. And you would just make them up. Like, and say you had like years of prayers that you had to make up. You would just estimate them, right? So what you want to do is kind of like pair up with all the prayers. You know, when you pray like your Fajr of today, then pray like Fajr that you missed from 5 years ago, right? And as long as you're working towards something, then after a few years, you would have caught them up. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so prostration, and then you have the final, like, kind of sitting. And the length of the final sitting is something that you would be sitting for like a duration of, you know, like 10 seconds, 15 seconds, right? What are some of the things that you see missing from here, if you've ever seen like a Muslim person pray, or you yourself have prayed before, in like a typical prayer?
Like the finger at some point.
Yeah, right, so you raise your finger, and we'll talk about that, and there's like certain things that you say, called the tashahhud, right? It's not written up here, you see? Yeah, what else?
What is that?
So this is, prostration is sajda, right? And you're just doing this like in the course of the prayer. Yeah. Yeah.
The Salam.
The salams, right? So when you're here, like you just end the prayer by doing something that's outside of the prayer. Do you know? So you, like most people when they're like finishing their prayer, what you would normally do is turn your head to the right and the left. You give what's called salam, assalamu alaikum, wa rahmatullah, assalamu alaikum, wa rahmatullah. But in like the basic structure of what is obligatory, that's not a part of it, right? How you would end the prayer is just by doing something that's an act outside of the prayer, you know? Like just get up, you know, grab your phone, do this, do that. You know what I mean? Yeah. But it's not like, I don't want to say that it's easy in the sense that there's not still like mechanics and stuff that goes to it, but it's very different from adding everything else that we said will be added, the necessary acts, which is like kind of the flesh to the body, the recommended acts, which is what kind of beautifies and gives kind of more of an ornamentation to it, right? This is really just about you're getting acquainted with it and you're doing what is required of you, because the prayer on its time, and even if you're praying it late, but you're still praying it, like it's still 5 that you got to get done in the day, you know? And you don't want to not do them because it's overwhelming to say, I don't know how to do it in its final form yet. Like that's what you're working towards. Do you get what I mean? And it's a lot more manageable when what you're getting accustomed to is just like the positions of it and the postures to it. And then we start adding things to it. Do you know what I mean? And so one of the things that is in the next category, that is the necessary acts, the wajib, is the recitation of the first chapter, Surah Fatiha, which you should be working on right now and thinking like, how do I add that to the prayer? Do you know what I mean? Right? And then you're just like building upon it each kind of day, week, month, and then you get the hang of it like in a way that's more systematic. And it's helpful because you don't want like anxiety to be a motivation. Like pressure can do certain things, right? Like we're at a university, you know, all of us have probably gone to some level of education. I don't know how many of you are like procrastinators or not. I wrote my honors thesis when I graduated for my undergrad, like 2 weeks after graduation, right? Clearly not like a good student, you know? But fundamentally, like for some people, when the deadline is there the next day, the adrenaline kicks in and they just like get it done, do you know? It's not gonna work that way when you're trying to engage in an act that is meant to bring you spiritual rest and inward balance and contentment. You don't want the onset to be something that says like, hey, this religion doesn't make sense for me because I'm not Arab. And why is God making me somehow now suddenly overnight know all of this and I don't even know what the words mean? But the idea is like you don't have to know all of those things overnight. Do you get what I'm saying? Right? And it allows for there to be then a progression that's gradual, that outside of the prayer you start to learn those things that we're going to go into a little bit more detail in the coming week, and break down a little bit more so that there is that much more of like a sense of presence as well as kind of systematic engagement. So what you want to do is what we talked about last week and we reviewed right at the beginning, the conditions of the prayer, right? What do you need like before you start to pray? You know, you get like your wudu, and when you're making wudu, take out like a piece of paper. This is what I gotta wash up. This is what I gotta do. This, do that. There's no shame in it, you know, as you're getting acquainted to it. When COVID, I herniated 2 discs in my neck, right? Our community is really big. We had a lot of things going on. I also was just like very sedentary, not taking care of myself so well, carrying a lot of people's trauma. My body was like literally collapsing on itself. When I herniated these discs, like this part of my shoulder swelled up to here. I had to reteach myself how to use my left hand. It was like pretty interesting of an experience. And when I was going to physical therapy, because it was COVID, everyone wasn't allowed to go to physical therapy. And we had members of our community who were physical therapists who allowed me to like come into their practices and offices. But the only people who were going to hospitals and physical therapists' office and these kinds of things at that time were like the people who were most immunocompromised, you know? So I'd walk into this physical therapy office and it was me and like 15 really old white ladies. And the physical therapist would hand me a weight that was like this neon pink 1 pound weight. And this old 80-year-old woman next to me is like, got like a 5 pound weight in her hand. And she's looking at me like I'm the most miserable thing in the world. And my physical therapist said, if you want, you know, we could be in a private room. I was like, no, man, I'm good. I'm not gonna let this old bully woman put me down, right? Because just because I'm at a certain place doesn't mean that that's where I'm gonna be. And this is just where I'm at right now, and that's fine, you know? And you don't have to think about it in any other way that I am somehow lacking or inadequate. How would you possibly know a language that you've never spoken before? Let alone, like, just spit it out fluidly in these ways. Do you get what I'm saying? So you want to have a sense of compassion towards yourself and recognition that, like, it's made with sensibility to get you from point A to point B. So equip yourself with the conditions that we talked about last week and recapped before this, and start to do this in these timings as you're getting acquainted and kind of learning the other things that we're going to be going through. Okay, so I want to take just 10 quick minutes before we wrap up to talk about kind of the season that we're in right now. So there is an Islamic calendar that is a lunar-based calendar. And the first month on that calendar is the month that we're in right now. It's called the month of Muharram. Fun fact, I was born on the 1st of Muharram, and I don't know how many lunar years old I am right now. Probably like 1 million. But Muharram has a couple of different meanings to different groupings of Muslims. For the Shia community, it's a very somber kind of grieving period. And we'll talk about it in a bit, but the base of it is a very tragic incident that every Muslim, like no matter where they're from, recognizes as a deeply tragic incident. They're Sunni, they're Shia, they come from any part of the world. Like historically, every Muslim has said this is an atrocious act. It's a deeply unifying concept because everyone agrees to it. There's an instance that takes place at a location called Karbala where the prevailing authorities essentially massacre the family members of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, inclusive of his grandson, Hussein, alayhi salam, may God be pleased with him. And we'll talk about that in like 3 minutes. But what you're gonna see here at our center, we're a very large community and also very diverse. And many mosques in like the whole world, let alone in New York City, tend to not just be like ethnocentric, very culturally hegemonic, right? For some of you who are like exploring Islam, you might have converted at some point recently or like years ago. If you've ever experienced like other communities, whether they're very welcoming or not, they tend to like have more of a sociological connection, right? Everyone is from a similar kind of ethnic background, cultural background, you know? New York City is built like this. You have Chinatown, a little Italy, these kinds of things, right? So you'll find 200 mosques in New York. There'll be like Sudanese mosque, a Malaysian mosque, there'll be Bengali mosque, a Yemeni mosque, like, you know, all of these different kinds of things. In our space, we have people that come from everywhere, right? Like if you literally just look at you all, right? Like everyone in this room is very different from everyone else in the rest of the room in different ways, right? And beyond cultural, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic diversity, we also have a community that's very diverse in terms of theology, in terms of like legal understandings. So you'll have both Sunnis and Shia that come to our center. And beyond that, you also have the unique aspect that on our staff, you have like someone like myself, who is a practicing Sunni Muslim. We have Sheikh Fayaz Jaffer, who's a trained Shia scholar, and we have had at other points other people on our staff that we have roles that probably in the next year we'll try to fill, but it's very purposefully done, do you know? Like I started working here when I was 25, and then Amira, who some of you have met, is our associate director, who's out on maternity leave right now. We hired her probably like 8 years after I started working here, and then we started hiring other people. But for me, there's an understanding that, you know, I have to pay for my weaknesses, right? I can't claim to be representative of all the diverse groupings of people that come to our center. So we had Sheikh Suhaib Webb was working here, Sheikh Aisha Prime was working here, Sheikh Fayaz Jaffer. People say, why do you hire these people? But one, I want like the best people to serve our community, because I love our community. But two, I'm not black, I'm not a convert, I'm not Shia. There's so many things that I'm fundamentally not. I need these voices at a table as we're like making decisions on things, but also representation as well as opportunity for engagement. And so you're gonna see in the next kind of week and a half, nightly, our Shia community in the prayer room is gonna be hosting what's our Muharram Majlis program. The word Majlis just means like a gathering, right? It literally is like a place where people are seated, you know, if we were to translate it most literally. But they're going to be recounting the narrative of the tragedy of Karbala that takes place. and leading up to the 10th of Muharram, which is where they will have in the morning of the 10th a service that probably has many more people. It's very somber, dealing with kind of everything culminating to the murder of the grandson of the Prophet of God. And then on the 11th, they'll have like a closing majlis in the night too, as well as on the 10th night. And you should feel comfortable in going to it, you know, whether you are Muslim or not, whether you identify as Sunni or Shia, whether you even know like which one you identify with or not, just to be able to kind of engage and understand the experience. It is a somber kind of gathering, so what you'll see is that people who are typically there, you know, they're wearing like darker clothes, and you'd find in the Shia community, they wouldn't be doing in these days like things that are celebratory. You know, there's no weddings, like, you know, birthdays, etc. These kinds of things, right? It's a very somber, grieving period. In the Sunni tradition, Karbala is also given like a deep recognition and deference towards. So what happens, to give you like a quick history 101, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passes away, there's not in the Sunni understanding, an outlined authoritative structure that is defined. In the Shia tradition, the understanding is that the authority should be passed on to Ali radiallahu anh, who is the son of the Prophet's uncle Abu Talib. Ali is also married to the Prophet's daughter Fatima. There's many Sunnis who thought Ali should also be in charge. There was people who thought like a variety of people should be in charge. In the Sunni tradition, the successorship is given to a man by the name of Abu Bakr, who becomes the first Sunni caliph of Islam, whereas Ali is the first like imam of the Shia tradition. So in the Shia community, they don't use the title imam for their religious leaders because it's reserved for particular individuals who are seen to be the rightful authoritative successors to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Does that make sense? Right? So like when you see Sheikh Fayaz Jafar, you're not going to call him Imam Fayaz, just as a matter of terminology. The word imam in the Shia tradition means something very different than it does in the Sunni tradition. So as the Sunni kind of understanding goes, you know, Abu Bakr is the caliph, and then there is Umar ibn al-Khattab, and under his caliphate there's a lot of kind of growth, etc. historically. Then you have a third caliph by the name of Uthman ibn Affan, and then you have a fourth that is Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is the first like imam of the Shia tradition. After Ali passes, you have his son Hassan, who is going to be the caliph, and another person by the name of Muawiyah, who becomes now the ruler, and Hassan abdicates his right to authority in exchange for the provision that there would be no harm done to any of the members of the Prophet Muhammad's family. And when Muawiyah is in charge, historically, this is something that is kind of carried forth on. He has a son by the name of Yazid. And in the Sunni tradition, right, Yazid is not seen as somebody who really has the ability to take on this authoritative leadership, right? He basically is like an idiot, you know? He like avid like alcohol drinker. He has like pet monkeys that he dresses up and has them dance in front of them, you know? When Yazid is now engaged in this kind of new model of authority that is dynastic, and he doesn't have this capacity, the other grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, Hussein, he refuses to pledge loyalty to him. There are others who do like take an oath of allegiance to his leadership, etc. And Hussein, radiallahu anh, the grandson of the Prophet, he goes from Medina to Mecca, and then there's people in a city called Kufa who, you know, we know is modern day Iraq, right, which is where Karbala is, they say, come to us, we're also not going to like have allegiance to this person. And he goes to Kufa, and essentially, to not go into too much detail, and if you come to Jummah on Friday, I'll talk about it in more detail, and when I tell you like what happens in the Sunni tradition, we have some fasting days prior to the fast breaking, which we'll do next Thursday and Friday. We'll probably talk about this in more detail. When he gets to Kufa, the people say they'll support him, and in reality what happens, there's like this overwhelming kind of presence of the dynastic leadership of Yazid. And so the Kufans, they say to Imam Hussein that our hearts are with you, but our swords are against you, right? And now you have the Prophet's remaining family members, you know, with Imam Hussein, and they get stationed in this place of Karbala, and they're essentially like attacking them, but nobody is like daring to do anything because this is the Prophet's grandson. You know, you have narrations in the prophetic tradition where the Prophet would like again and again like express the love he had for his grandchild, you know, and give a deep insight into just how beloved his family was to them. And then they eventually get to a place where somebody who is in the army of Yazid, that is a known kind of transgressor against the community, you know, takes like this first shot, and in a very brutal kind of interaction, they end up decapitating the Prophet's grandson and sending his head to Damascus, you know, as kind of a, you know, is what it is. The lessons that kind of come from this are rooted from a Sunni tradition standpoint in how Sunni Muslims observe the 10th of Muharram, where in Medina, the Prophet Muhammad comes upon a group of Jewish people, and he sees them fasting on the 10th of Muharram. And he asks, why are you fasting on this day? And they said that this was the day that Moses was, and the children of Israel, you know, they were emancipated from the tyranny of Pharaoh, right? It's the day of the Exodus. So the Prophet says, like, we have more of a right to Moses than you do. And he tells people to fast. And he says next year, right, fast either the day before it also and the day after, like couple a day with it, to make it a unique practice from other religious traditions that might fast on that day. And so the recommendation is to fast on that day, and to fast either the day before or the day after. And what the tradition says, it's an expiation of like sins for the year in and of itself. And there's other narrations that say that on this day of the 10th of Muharram, you know, this was the day that Adam returned back to God after eating from the tree that he wasn't supposed to eat from, right? He makes like a sincere return to God, acknowledging his mistake. There's no concept of original sin in Islam, right? Each individual is held accountable for their own, but Adam is like the first human, his human tendencies. This is a day that it says the flood of Noah, you know, was stopped, like the storm that was creating this flood, right? There's other instances that come up. So how do these things relate? The sacrifice and kind of martyrdom of Hussein is seen from the lens of social justice and a sense of just like commitment to what is right and good, to be like the just most exemplary thing that you could think of. Because you want to conceptualize, right? Here's one person that's now standing in front of an entire army and is being told, like, let go of everything you hold as a virtue and value. And in the face of just inescapable odds, he still stands on what is right and what is just. There's a verse in one of the shorter chapters of the Quran that says, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, that we made humanity in the most beautiful of forms. And then the next verse says, ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ سَافِلِينَ, and we let them fall to the lowest of the low. but it creates a paradoxical understanding of the human, that within each of us is the capacity to be both an agent of real goodness as well as an agent of real ugliness. And you have now an extreme juxtaposition of real beauty from the kind of standing of Hussein at Karbala and real ugliness at the standpoint of those who are motivated by greed and materialism and all of these things. And so there's a deep recognition of taking a lot of lessons from this, from the standpoint of, principles, values, social justice, etc., as well as a recognition that in Islam, the idea is that you're living for something bigger than this world. And so where and how the understanding is that you find something that is so worth living for that you're not willing to let go of it, even if it costs you like literally everything that you have in your full like physical capacity. You know what I mean? And so he's living for something that is so big to him that he's willing to die for it, right? And we'll go into it in more detail, but this is what you're gonna see our Shia community kind of recounting the narrative that kind of gets to it. It's a very kind of somber experience, especially as you get into the latter half of these 10 days. We will be having, for the community more broadly, within the Sunni tradition, next Thursday and Friday, like fast-breaking meals that you're more than welcome to join and come. We'll keep the building open so that people can participate in them. We won't have lunch next Friday because we'll be encouraging people to fast as we would normally have lunch. But that's essentially what are kind of some of the key parts to this. This month of Muharram is also said to be one of 4 sacred months, right? So within the Islamic calendar, there's 4 sacred months that we're given insight on, and Muharram is one of them. In the Sunni tradition, like fasting in this month, just in general, is something that is recommended to do. Fasting, if you're capable of doing it, is just seen as like a spiritual exercise that Muslims are encouraged to do, not because it's about kind of a emptying of the stomach, but it's about a fullness of the heart, right? Like you're not limiting nourishment, you're just nourishing now parts of yourself that get neglected in other ways. Ramadan is an obligatory fast, but these are recommended fasts. And within it, like just engaging in other kind of good acts, etc., etc. But it's the first month on the Muslim calendar and other things that we'll talk about in more detail. I just want to give you like a base overview to it. And then the last thing I'm going to say that kind of can offer just more of a generic sense of understanding. Theologically, to be Muslim, and we've talked about this before, there's 3 fundamental beliefs that you look at. There's a very pure monotheism in Islam, like one God and that's it. And the understanding of this God is essentially different from other monotheistic religions, right? In Islam, the knowledge of God that we have is a negative knowledge, right? We know who God is by knowing who God is not. There's a verse in the Quran that says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay." There's not anything that's like a likeness to him. And so there's no anthropomorphizing of God in any capacity in Islam, right? God is distinct from his creation in every which way, but that's one theology. So if somebody says, I'm Muslim, but I don't believe in God, or I'm Muslim, but I believe in more than one God, right? You might not like go in somebody's face and be like, you're not a real Muslim, but they're not within the categorical definition of what makes a Muslim theologically. What makes somebody a practitioner of a religion is the theology, right? As much as like people can be culturally this, in some places you can be ethnically, like Jewish, for example, but what you buy into when you practice a religion is the theology, right? And so the foundational theology of Islam is first rooted in a pure monotheism. The second theology here is the finality of prophethood in the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So if somebody said, I'm Muslim, but I don't believe that Muhammad is a prophet, or I'm Muslim, but I believe there's a prophet after the Prophet Muhammad, you could say, well, that's something that would be problematic. And then third, you have the belief in an afterlife, right? There's no concept of an afterlife in the Meccan Arabia. right? And even here, in a supremacist society, right, an anti-black society, like deeply secularized, it's not that it's godless in the sense that there's no discussions of God, but its secularization is such that it instills within the psyche of those who are embedded in it and its structure that there's nothing that's after this. Like, this is just it. Live in such a way where you're only thinking about accountability within the sense of what's present here and now, right? It's not telling you like, hey, there's something that is beyond this world, and there's a proportionality of this world to the world that comes beyond this one. This is what Muslims believe. Now, when you branch it down to Shia and Sunni, this is still embodied within that overarching understanding of what makes somebody Muslim. Does that make sense? So here you would have now like belief in what's called the imamate, right? Like those successors that we're talking about, right? Sunnis believe in the righteousness of all the companions. And this then informs like practice, because they're basically saying these are the people that we think were authoritative. These are people that we think are authoritative. So they're not going to consider each person in the same way. Does that make sense? Right? But the gross majority of everything is the same. Everybody's praying towards Mecca. There's 5 prayers in a day. You're fasting in Ramadan. There's pilgrimage to, Mecca. There is charity. There's like all of these things. The same Quran. Do you get what I'm saying? But you'll see like practice come up differently. You'll see people who don't know like why they are what they are. You'll see like sociological kind of tendencies more so than kind of theological understandings of what renders identity. The Shia community is a gross minority within a minority, right? And just like any minority experience on a practical level, you have a lot that defaults towards the majority and what's privileged that's there. Do you know what I mean? So it's also like a great learning opportunity for our community to see just how we kind of coincide and can kind of engage one another side by side. So if you have a chance, like go to some of the programs. They're going to start with dinner at 6 every day. And then at around 7-ish, a little after 7, they'll get into like the content of the program. We are keeping the building open until 10 because of those programs, but in the prayer room, that's going to be happening till 10 o'clock. So if you end up sticking around and you have a prayer that comes in the Sunni tradition, the time for Maghrib begins probably about like 15 to 20 minutes earlier than in the Shia tradition. And so you can just pray a prayer, in one of the other rooms while the program is still going on. But like participate if you'd like. And if you're able to, and you're gonna fast next week, we'll have iftar on Thursday and Friday. And we'll do that likely upstairs here on Thursday on the 5th floor. And on Friday, we'll probably do it on the 10th floor of the building next door. Yeah, go ahead.
So is the day that we're supposed to fast the 11th or the 10th of Muharram?
The 10th of Muharram
Okay.
is the day that the Prophet saw the Jewish people in Medina fasting at a commemoration of the exodus of the children of Israel.
Okay.
Yeah, and then he said, next year, like when we observe this again, we should couple it with another fasting day to distinguish the practice from the practice that they found, right? So either the day before or the day after. So because our building is closed the day after, on Saturday in the summer, we're gonna just do it on Thursday and Friday. We typically would normally just do it on the 10th, but just to encourage people to try to fast like a day in conjunction with it,
Okay.
we'll do it on Thursday and Friday.
But Friday and Saturday would also be fine.
Friday and Saturday would also work.
Okay.
And also if you only do Friday, that would work too.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Well, first off, I would have said takbir, like that was beautiful, like what you just said. I grew up in a mixed house. So
Okay.
I was a sushi growing up. So I made a conscious decision when I got older to learn a little bit more, and I followed more of a Sunni Hanafi fiqh Islam. that was, I just wanted to say, like, that was very, very nice.
Oh man, thank you, that's very
Yeah,
kind.
that was- Because
Yeah.
my father would have, definitely would have appreciated, my father was Shia, so this was like, he didn't really, I think Sheikh Fayyaz said this once, that some people, at times, they might identify first as being Shia before being Muslim. So my father, like, eating the samosa and doing a lot of Shia things in Muharram, this was like his Islam. Like, he really valued Muharram and like telling me not to watch wrestling in Muharram or sports. So yeah, thank you for saying all that. That was nice.
Great, thank you for bringing these. If you didn't get one, feel free to please grab some before I eat all of them. And there's also one over there. There's also dinner still from the Majlis program. So even if you don't stick around, if you want to grab some food, it's in the other classroom on the other side of the lounge. I think they got Chinese food tonight. It'll be like various different cuisines, similar to if you were here in Ramadan, we had iftar. It'll be Italian food, like Mediterranean, soul food, different things. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I just remember, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 holidays ago, or classes ago, we were mentioning like whiteboards and like practicing Arabic on them. I got some for
Yeah.
people, so like if you want to take them home and practice your Arabic. I don't know if I'm just like leave them with you and people can take them.
That'd be great.
Okay. I feel like those, I don't know if you remember like in elementary school, there was the double-sided like kind of cheap ones, but I figured it'd be useful.
So part of this class normally is that we would do the Arabic letters also. So thank you, Kiara, for getting these. If you want to grab one on your way out, and just bring it week to week, and we'll resume with those next week as well.
There's the markers and the erasers with them.
So fancy.
I know.
Look at you. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully you guys can benefit from it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I have one more question. On the expiation part, so Arafah, right, that was expiation for the year before and the year after. If you fast on the 10th, that's just,
It's just 1 year.
okay.
Yeah. It's different from autumn, but
Okay.
it's still a good thing to do.
I know, I just asked to like understand
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
technicalities and.
Yeah. And when you go home or on your phone, you can just look up, the significance of the 10th of Muharram, the day of Ashura. There'll be like hadith and things that come up too. Yeah. Great. Okay. Thank you, guys.